My name is Renata Shields. I'm 33 years old. And the night my brother stood up at my father's retirement party and told 60 people I had never given this family a single thing was the night I finally understood that the truth doesn't need your permission to exist. He said it during the toast. My brother Owen had been holding the microphone for approximately 4 minutes when he got to me. He had talked about my father's work ethic, his 31 years at the firm, the sacrifices he and my mother had made. Then he paused, the specific pause of someone who has rehearsed what comes next, and said that not every member of the family had honored those sacrifices equally. He said that some people take and never think about what they owe. He said, raising his glass toward my father, "Here's to the man who gave everything, even to the one child who took and never gave back." My father raised his glass. My mother smiled at the centerpiece. I kept my hands flat on the tablecloth and looked at the candle in the middle of the table and let him finish. I did not stand. I did not reach for my own glass. I pressed my palms lightly against the linen and held them there until I felt the fabric's texture against my skin and my breathing had settled to something even. What none of those 60 people knew, what Owen had no reason to suspect when he had invited Douglas Harrell to the party as a gesture of professional ambition, was that Douglas had spent the better part of 9 years on the receiving end of wire transfers sent from my account to my parents. He had processed all of them. He knew the dates. He knew the amounts. He had, in fact, flagged one of them for a routine compliance review 3 years earlier because the transfer was large enough to require documentation, and I had provided it without complaint. Douglas Harrell was seated 2 tables away. He had a glass of sparkling water in front of him and his hands resting on the table and the particular stillness of a man who has just heard something in a professional context that does not match what he knows to be professionally true. He waited until Owen sat down. Then he cleared his throat once, quietly, and asked my brother a very simple question. Let me tell you how I got to that table. Because none of what happened that evening makes sense without the 9 years that came before it, and those 9 years do not make sense without understanding the particular arithmetic of my family. My father, Gordon Shields, retired at 62 after 31 years as a mid-level operations manager at a regional manufacturing firm. He was reliable and well-regarded and had never in his professional life done anything flashy, which suited him. He had a pension, a modest 401k, and a house with a mortgage that had 14 years left on it when he retired. He also had 2 children, Owen, who was 4 years older than me and had stayed in our home city and built a life that was visible and legible to my parents, and me, Renata, who had left at 22 for a position at a supply chain consulting firm 3 states away and had been, in the years since, largely out of frame. Owen had worked in commercial real estate for 8 years. He knew people. He had business cards and a firm handshake and the ability to make our father feel, at any given family dinner, that things were moving in the right direction. He had also, over those 8 years, borrowed $34,000 from my parents in amounts that had been described, each time, as temporary. A bridge loan while a deal closed, a short-term gap before a commission came through. My parents had not pressed him on repayment. They were not the kind of people who pressed. My father believed that family took care of family, and in his model that meant the giving went in one direction, and the receiving was not a moral failure. I had understood this model early. I had also understood, earlier than I could have articulated it, that the model applied to Owen in a way it did not quite apply to me. This is not a grievance. It is a structural observation. Owen was the first child and the son, and he had remained physically present, which meant my parents knew the texture of his life, the deals that fell through, the rent increases, the slow months, in a way they did not know mine. Distance produces a kind of abstraction. I had become, in their understanding, someone who had simply left and was fine. Fine was the word my mother used when relatives asked about me. Renata is fine. She's doing well out there. The specifics were not available to them because I had not supplied them, and I had not supplied them because I had been raised in a family where the gap between what you said and what you did not say was understood to be private. What I had not said, over 9 years, was this. When my father had a cardiac event at 58 and missed 6 weeks of work and my parents found themselves short on the mortgage for the first time, I had transferred $7,400 into their joint account without being asked. My mother had called to thank me, and I had said it was nothing and she had not mentioned it again. When Owen's commercial deal fell through in the second year, and he called my father instead of a bank, my father had covered Owen's rent for 4 months at $1,850 per month, which had put my parents in a position where their own savings buffer was thinner than it had been. I had sent $6,000 the following month. I told my mother it was just something extra, that I had a good quarter. She said that was generous. She did not tell Owen. When the furnace in the house failed the winter, I was 27, and the replacement cost was $9,200, and my parents were already carrying Owen's outstanding $34,000 in informal loans. I paid the furnace invoice directly. I called the contractor myself, got the quote, and paid it before my parents had finished debating whether to take money from the 401k. My father found out when the contractor called to say the invoice had been settled. He called me and said I shouldn't have done that. I said the alternative was worse. He said he would pay me back. He didn't, and I had not expected him to, and I had not kept a record of it in any way that was meant to be produced later. I kept records because I am a person who keeps records. I work in supply chain consulting, which is to say I spend my professional life tracing the movement of things, materials, money, obligations from one place to another, and I have an instinct for documentation that is simply how I am built. The wire transfers were documented because wire transfers are always documented. The furnace payment was documented because I had asked for and received a receipt. The $7,400 was documented because the bank statement records it as a transfer, and I had never deleted a bank statement in my adult life. I had not assembled these records with any intent. They existed the way most evidence exists, quietly in the background, waiting for the moment when someone would need to know what actually happened. The retirement party had been Owen's idea. He had organized it, the venue, the catering, the guest list, and he had done it with genuine care for my father, which I want to be clear about. Owen loved our father. The party was a real expression of that love. The guest list was 60 people, most of them from my father's professional circle, some family, a few neighbors. Owen had also invited 3 people from his own professional network, which was not unusual. These were people he wanted to impress, to show that he was the kind of man whose family hosted 60-person events at a banquet room in a decent hotel. One of those 3 was Douglas Harrell. Douglas was the branch manager at the mid-size regional bank where Owen had recently opened a business account for a new commercial property venture. Owen had met him twice. He had introduced him to my father as someone important in the local finance world, which was a mild inflation of Douglas's actual role but not a fabrication. Douglas was competent and well-connected locally, and the kind of person Owen liked to be seen knowing. What Owen did not know, what he could not have known because I had never mentioned it to anyone in my family, was that Douglas Harrell had been the branch manager at that same bank for 11 years, and that 9 years ago, when I had opened a secondary account specifically for the purpose of sending money to my parents without mixing it with my operating finances, I had opened it at that branch. I had chosen it because it was close to my parents' address, which made the transfers cleaner. I had never thought about the manager. I had simply done my banking. Douglas had not recognized my name when Owen introduced us before dinner. He had shaken my hand and asked how I knew the guest of honor, and I said he was my father, and he said that was wonderful, and we had moved to our separate tables. He had recognized it, the name, the account, the years of transactions, when Owen said it into the microphone. I watched his expression shift from the polite attention of a party guest to the calibrated alertness of a professional who has just heard something that does not match his records. He did not react visibly. He set his sparkling water down and returned his hands to the table and waited for Owen to finish. After the toast, the room redistributed itself in the way rooms do after a formal moment. People reached for their wine. Conversations resumed. A few guests near my father's table stood to offer their own brief remarks. Owen returned to his seat looking satisfied in the way of someone who has said the thing they came to say. I had not moved from my position. Hands flat, back straight, attention forward, through the duration of the toast. When it ended, I picked up my water glass and took a sip and set it down and looked at the candle and waited for my breathing to finish evening out. My mother, 2 seats away from me, had not looked at me during the toast. She looked at me now, briefly, with an expression I recognized. The look of someone who has witnessed something they're not certain they should have permitted, and who has decided, in the moment, that the cost of addressing it is higher than the cost of not addressing it. She reached for her bread roll. I looked away. My father, at the head of the table, was accepting congratulations from a colleague on his left. He had the expression of a man who has just been praised publicly and is warm with it, and I think in that moment he had not fully registered what Owen had said about me, or rather had registered it in the way my father registered most things about me, which was at a distance as background, as a thing that was probably fine. Douglas Harrell stood approximately 4 minutes after Owen sat down. He did not go to the microphone. He simply pushed back his chair and walked the 2 tables to where Owen was seated and bent slightly and said something close to Owen's ear. Owen's head turned. I could not hear what Douglas said in that first moment. What I saw was Owen's posture change, the particular shift of a man who has been asked a question he was not prepared to answer in this room, at this moment, in front of these people. Douglas straightened and said, clearly enough that the table could hear, I just want to make sure I have the right account. Renata Shields, she's your sister? Owen said yes. Douglas nodded. He said, she's been a customer at our branch for 9 years. The account she keeps there is a transfer account. She uses it exclusively for outgoing wires. He paused. To your parents' joint account. The table, my table, 8 people went very still. Douglas said, I recognized the name when you mentioned it. I wanted to make sure I wasn't confusing anyone. He looked at Owen with an expression that was entirely neutral. I'm not confused. Then he asked the question. He said, how long did you say she hadn't been contributing? Owen's mouth opened. His hand, which had been resting on the stem of his wine glass, lifted slightly and then set back down. He did not answer. Douglas nodded once, as if the silence were itself an answer, which it was. He said, I'm sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to be accurate. He looked briefly at my father, then at me, and then he walked back to his table and sat down and picked up his sparkling water.
My father was looking at me.
I looked back at him. I did not elaborate. I did not say anything at all. I picked up my fork and returned my attention to the plate in front of me. The dinner continued. The continuation of the dinner after Douglas's question was one of the stranger experiences I have had in a room full of people I have known most of my life. Conversations resumed, but carefully, in the way conversations resume when everyone in the room is aware that something significant has just occurred and no one has yet decided what to do with it. My father's colleague on his left said something about the salmon. My father responded. My mother asked whether anyone wanted more bread. Owen refilled his wine glass. I ate. The salmon was prepared well. I finished it and set my fork across the plate in the way my mother had taught us when we were children, a small, instilled precision that I had never unlearned, and I picked up my water and drank and looked at the room. At his table, Douglas Harrell was speaking quietly to the woman seated beside him. He had the manner of someone who has said the thing that needed to be said and has returned to the ordinary business of the evening. Later, as the party moved from dinner into the dessert and coffee portion, Owen came to find me. He came to the corner near the windows where I had stepped briefly to check a message on my phone. He came alone. He did not have his wine glass. He stood in front of me with his hands in his jacket pockets and his expression arranged into something that was not quite an apology and not quite a confrontation, but somewhere in between, the expression of a man who has done something that cannot be undone and is now trying to locate the frame that makes it most survivable. He said, I didn't know about the account. I said, I know. He said, I genuinely thought you hadn't been, that you weren't in a position to. I said, I know what you thought. He looked at the window. Outside, the hotel parking lot was dark and the lights in the lot were orange, and there was a car pulling out slowly. He said, that was embarrassing. I said, yes. He said, why didn't you ever say anything to me or to Mom and Dad about what you were sending? This is the question I had expected. It is also the question I had spent approximately 9 years not answering, not because I didn't have an answer, but because every version of the answer required explaining something about our family that our family had never agreed to examine. I said, because it wasn't a negotiation. I did it because it needed doing. I didn't do it to be credited for it. He was quiet. I said, "The problem isn't that I didn't tell you. The problem is that you stood up in front of 60 people and said something you had decided was true without checking whether it was." He looked at me directly then. Something in his face shifted. Not dramatically, not a collapse, but the small, specific movement of a man who has arrived at an accurate self-assessment and found it uncomfortable. He said, "I wanted Dad to feel like I was the one who had been here." I said, "I know that too." We stood there for a moment. I said, "I'm not going to make this into something larger than it needs to be. But I'm also not going to pretend tonight was a misunderstanding. You knew what you were doing when you wrote that toast. You had a reason for it, and I understand the reason. That doesn't make it something I'll agree to forget." He said he understood. I said, "Good." I excused myself and went back to the table for coffee. My father found me at the end of the evening, near the coat check. He was a man who had spent 31 years in operations, which meant he had spent 31 years solving problems with the minimum amount of visible disruption, and he brought that orientation to most things in his personal life as well. He was not a man who made speeches. He was a man who said the necessary thing in the most compact form available to him. He came to stand beside me while I waited for my coat. He looked at the coat check counter for a moment, and then he said, "I didn't know about the account." I said, "I know, Dad." He said, "Your mother might have known. In the general sense. She doesn't talk about money the way I do." I said that was possible. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I should have known. That's what I mean." I looked at him. He was 62 years old, and he had just had his retirement party, and he was standing at a coat check in a hotel banquet room trying to say something that his whole life had not particularly equipped him to say. I understood the effort. I accepted it for what it was. I said, "You raised us to handle things." I handled things. That's all. He said, "You handled things without telling anyone." I said, "Someone had to." He accepted the coat the attendant handed him and held it for a moment. Then he said, "The furnace too?" I said yes. He put the coat on. He buttoned it. He said, "Renata." I looked at him. He said, "Thank you." It was 2 words. It was the most direct thing my father had said to me in 33 years of my life, and I received it the way you receive something that has been a long time arriving. Not with relief exactly, not with the release of something that had been held too tightly, but with the quiet recognition that it had finally come. I said, "You're welcome, Dad." We walked out to the parking lot together. My mother joined us, and we stood briefly in the orange light, and she said the salmon had been very good, and we agreed that it had been, and my father said Owen had found a good venue, which was true, and we said goodnight. Owen called me 8 days later. He had spent those 8 days, I learned gradually over the following months, in a kind of private accounting, not of money, but of the story he had been telling himself about our family, and his place in it and mine. His wife, a practical woman named Deborah, who had always been privately skeptical of certain things Owen said about me at family gatherings, had apparently not been gentle in the days after the party. I know this not because Owen told me directly, but because Deborah called me herself 3 weeks after the party and said she wanted to apologize on behalf of the evening, and I told her she had nothing to apologize for, and she said she appreciated that, but she was going to apologize anyway because she felt it was owed. Owen's call was brief. He said he had been thinking about what I had said near the windows, about checking whether something was true before saying it in public, and that he didn't have a good answer for why he hadn't. He said the honest answer was that the story had been easier to believe because it let him occupy a position in the family that he needed. The capable one. The present one. The one who had held things together while I was gone. I said I understood that. He said, "You were holding things together too. You were just doing it from somewhere I couldn't see." I said that was an accurate description. He asked whether we were all right. I said that depended on what he meant. He said he meant going forward. Dinners. Christmas. The ordinary continuity. I said, "I'll be at Christmas. I'll be at whatever dinners matter. But I need you to understand that going forward, if you have a question about what I'm doing or what I've contributed, you ask me directly. You don't build a toast out of an assumption." He said he understood that. I said, "Then yes, we're all right." We said goodbye. I made a note in my calendar for Christmas, and then I closed the calendar, and went back to the work I had been doing before he called. The professional consequences for Owen were not swift or dramatic. They were the natural result of a man whose behavior had been witnessed by someone in a position to form a professional opinion. Douglas Harrell and Owen had been in early conversations about potential financing for Owen's commercial property venture. Nothing signed, nothing committed, but the kind of exploratory relationship that Owen had been cultivating. Those conversations did not continue. Douglas did not make an announcement. He did not call Owen and say the party had changed his assessment. He simply became unavailable, scheduling conflicts, a redirect to a junior colleague, the natural attrition of a professional relationship that has lost its warmth. Owen recognized what had happened. He told me this himself, 6 months later, in a way that was more rueful than resentful. He said, "I burned that myself." I said I thought that was probably right. The financing he had been hoping Douglas's bank might provide eventually came from a different institution, at less favorable terms. The project was smaller than he had planned. It did fine. Owen did fine. He was not a bad businessman, and the setback was real, but survivable, and I think it was the kind of setback that a person who is paying attention can learn from. I do not know whether Owen has learned from it. That is not mine to know. What I know is that the version of events he told publicly, on the night of my father's retirement party, was corrected publicly, in the same room, by a person with direct knowledge of the facts, and that Owen had provided Douglas Harrell with both the occasion and the motivation by inviting him in the first place. That is not a lesson I taught him. It is a lesson he taught himself. My parents' understanding of the 9 years shifted slowly and incompletely in the way that understanding shifts in people who have held a particular picture for a long time. My mother, it turned out, had known more than she had let on. She had been aware of several of the transfers, had received them into the joint account, had simply not discussed them with my father or with Owen because she operated, as I did, in the space of things that go unsaid. We had a conversation about this, she and I, about 3 months after the party, on a Sunday afternoon when I was visiting and my father was watching a game in the other room. She said she had not wanted to make it complicated. I said, I understood that. She said, I think I should have said something. When Owen started telling that version of things, I should have said something before it got to a toast. I said, yes. She looked at her hands. Then she looked up and said, I'm sorry, Renata. It was the first time my mother had apologized to me for anything in my adult life. I do not say this as an indictment of her character. She was a woman shaped by a family that did not apologize, who had married a man shaped the same way, and she had done what she could with the tools she had. The apology was real. It cost her something. I said, thank you, Mom. She nodded and stood and went to refresh her tea, and asked if I wanted any, and I said yes, and we sat together at the kitchen table for another hour, talking about ordinary things, the neighbor's garden, a television series she had started, the new road construction on the highway, and it was not a repaired relationship, exactly, but it was a real one. Present and honest, and conducted between two people who were no longer maintaining a fiction about the shape of things. That, for me, was enough. The ledger that my family had been keeping in their heads, the one that had me on one side and Owen on the other, the one where I was the taker and he was the giver, was not corrected by anything I did that night. I did not stand up and produce bank statements. I did not make a countertoast. I pressed my palms against a linen tablecloth and looked at a candle and waited for the evening to tell its own truth.
It did.
That is the thing I want you to hold. You cannot control the story your family agrees to tell about you. You cannot correct it in real time without becoming the person who is making a scene, which becomes the next story they tell. What you can do is maintain the accurate record, not as a weapon, not as a performance, but simply because accuracy is what you owe to yourself and to the events as they actually occurred. Sometimes the record is just there, in a bank system, in a contractor's receipt, in the 11 years of institutional memory of a branch manager who happened to be seated 2 tables away. Sometimes the correction comes from outside, from a person with no stake in the family mythology, who simply names what is true because they have no reason not to. When that happens, your job is not to gloat. It is not to escalate. It is to sit with your fork in your hand and your back straight, and let the room adjust to the new information. The room will adjust. People almost always adjust when the facts are clear and the source is credible and the person most affected stays still. I stayed still. That was the whole of my contribution to what happened that evening. The rest was just the truth, finally finding a room where it fit. Thank you for being here. Genuinely, the fact that you chose to spend this hour with this story means something, and I don't take it for granted. If you've been here before, you know that new stories go up every week, and every one of them is about the same essential thing. What happens when someone who has been written off stops agreeing with that assessment, not with a speech, not with a confrontation, but with the slow, quiet accumulation of the truth. If this is your first time, welcome. Subscribe if you'd like to be here for the next one. There's always a next one, and they're always worth the hour. If this story landed somewhere in you, if you've ever been the person whose contribution was invisible until it suddenly wasn't, leave a comment. You don't need to tell the whole story. Even a sentence. The comment section on these videos has some of the most honest writing I've encountered anywhere, and it matters. Share it with someone who needs it. That's the whole ask. I'll see you in the next one.